This is BBC News, and these are the top stories developing at 11. Hello, a very good morning to you. It's Friday, the 8th of December. I'm Anita McVeigh, and welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. A deal has been agreed in the Brexit talks, allowing the negotiations to move on to the next crucial stage on trade and transition. In the last few minutes, the BBC has learned that the divorce bill could be between 35 and 40 billion pounds. Well, after a long night of phone diplomacy and an early morning dash to Brussels, Theresa May secured agreement with the Irish Prime Minister and the Democratic Unionists, whose objections on the issue of the Irish border had prevented a deal being struck on Monday. An agreement has been made on the key sticking points of Phase 1, including, of course, the divorce bill, EU citizens' rights and the Irish border. It still needs approval from the 27 member states first, although this is likely to go ahead. The European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker announced that sufficient progress had been made to allow talks to go on. He said it was the breakthrough that was needed, but he reiterated that today's result is a compromise. Meanwhile, Mrs May said give and take on both sides had delivered a hard-won agreement in all our interests. Well, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, praised the Prime Minister for her determination and said the negotiations have been difficult for both sides. Well, let's go to Brussels now. Our correspondent, Kevin Connolly, is there for us. Kevin, a very intense night and morning for all those involved. And, you know, if people thought getting to this stage was hard, then the President of the European Council was suggesting that what is to come could be even more difficult. But just assess for us, first of all, how the EU is feeling about the last 12 hours or so and what has been achieved. Let's go now to get the view from Westminster with Vicky Young, who's waiting there for us. Vicky, it's been a night of, and a morning indeed, of high stakes and political drama. Where in the negotiations at this point does the UK think it's done well? What aspects does it consider still to be very tricky? And of course, we're going to bring you much more analysis of what's been happening in terms of the Brexit agreement throughout Newsroom Live. But right now we can move on to some other news. And a number of new wildfires have started in Southern California, stretching firefighters to the limit. Nearly 200,000 people have now been forced to evacuate their homes. Well, let's get more now on our top story. And the UK and the European Union have reached a deal on some key Brexit sticking points that opens the way for talks to move on to a future trade relationship. After months of, at times, ill-tempered negotiations, the European Commission said sufficient progress had been made on key issues. The other EU members will consider this recommendation at a summit next week. Let's get more now with our chief political correspondent, Vic. Let's speak now to John Tong, who's Professor of British and Irish Politics at the University of Liverpool, and he's in Salford this morning. John, very good as ever to have you with us. First of all, just give us your overall impression of the deal that's been done overnight, bearing in mind that it's simply the end of the beginning, as one former Northern Ireland Secretary described it this morning. Thank you for your thoughts today. In a moment, we'll have a summary of the business news this hour with business reaction to the Brexit deal. But first, the headlines on BBC Newsroom Live. The headlines are coming up on the BBC News channel in a moment. We say goodbye to viewers on BBC Two. But first, let's leave you with a look at the weather. Lots to get through with Simon King. He's got all the details. Hi, Simon. Hello, good afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of December. I'm Anita McVeigh and welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. A deal has been agreed in the Brexit talks, allowing the negotiations to move on to the next crucial stage on trade and transition. After a long night of phone diplomacy and an early morning dash to Brussels, Theresa May secured agreement with the Irish Prime Minister and the Democratic Unionists, whose objections on the issue of the Irish border had prevented a deal being struck on Monday. Some of the key agreements include the so-called divorce bill, the amount the UK will pay to cover its obligations when it leaves. It's worth between 35 to 39 billion pounds, the BBC understands. EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens living within the EU will have their rights to live, work and study protected. And according to Mrs May, there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Now, there have been clashes between Palestinian protesters and Israeli security forces following Friday prayers today. Security had been stepped up after the militant group Hamas called for a day of rage in response to President Trump saying that he would move the US embassy to Jerusalem. Our correspondent John Donnison reports.
GMT, I'm David.
And that was the Irish Deputy Prime Minister Simon Coveney talking to my colleague David Eads in Brussels. Now, it is time for a look at the weather forecast with some tricky weather expected this weekend. Let's get all the details from Louise. And we've just had some reaction from the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn to the Brexit agreement. He's speaking in Geneva at the moment, and he says that Britain's future relationship with Europe should be based on solidarity, mutual benefit and fair trade, and on proactive internationalism. That reaction coming from Jeremy Corbyn. He's speaking as I talk to you, so if there's any further reaction to the Brexit agreement from him, we'll bring you those details later on. But of course, lots of other people have been reacting to news of the agreement that allows movement on to the second phase of the negotiations, crucially on trade, of course. Let's get a sense of that reaction now from our chief political correspondent. Now, the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and Theresa May said both sides had agreed that the rights of European Union citizens in the UK and British citizens living in the EU would remain the same after Brexit. Moving on to other news now, and the Health Secretary says the NHS in England must be better at dealing with mental health crisis cases. Jeremy Hunt was speaking to the BBC's Newsbeat about their recent documentary, which follows 4 Radio 1 listeners. Mr Hunt admits there's a bottleneck in parts of the country for mental health beds. Newsbeat's political editor Jim Connolly reports. Colin Patterson reporting. Now, firefighters spent an hour freeing an internet prankster who cemented his head inside